I'd like to thank the University College London Islamic Society and Student Union for graciously inviting me here today to talk about the question whether Islam is expired in the 21st century. But rather, I view the question as more, is Islam still relevant for the 21st century? Does it require reformation? Or is it the only untried solution in the world today, and it merely requires to be revived? Now, secular liberalism is the current dominant ideology of Western civilization today. It was spread by Western military and political colonialism throughout the world, and many new nations and states were created out of former colonies by the West to continue its implementation. The followers of secular liberalism, or liberals for short, believe in an ideology of the supremacy and sovereignty of the individual in worldly life above society, culture, religion, and God. Consequently, all ideas, morals, and laws that emanate from the West are usually justified with regards to this philosophical creed. The West views its ideology as universal and therefore believes that everyone has the right to live under that system even if you don't want to or your people don't want to. Anyone reading the works of John Stuart Mill, Bentham, or Alexis de Tocqueville, as well as modern-day liberal philosophers like John Rawls, will see that they have argued for intervention in non-liberal countries to civilize them, even if those countries and those peoples don't want to be, quote-unquote, civilized by whatever Western standards is considered. Now, this is the kind of context we see in the world today, and I wanted to state, obviously, the ideology of secular liberalism, because the big question is, what is Islam to be reformed into, and who is calling for the reformation of Islam? Now, I don't come here to discuss secular liberalism per se, however, merely to highlight that secular liberalism is just one political philosophy, and there are many other political philosophies, or even all comprehensive philosophies, like obviously Marxism or communism, and of course I would argue Islam. I'd also argue that before colonialism, every nation had a religion which was holistic. It guided their rules, their laws, how they led their life. For example, Hinduism wasn't called Hinduism prior to British colonialism. It was called Dharma, which means law. The Torah also means law in the Old Testament. And of course, we see this in every religion, that their religion was also their law. And this idea of secularism only came about very recently after the West came to a lot of these countries and nations and secularized them and supplanted their religion in their political system. But going back into the history of Islamic civilization, we see that at the very beginning, the Islamic civilization instituted pluralism and interfaith tolerance. Islam does believe in its own universalism. However, it is very much part of the Islamic worldview that mankind has to voluntarily accept Islam's position on human purpose, and it can't be forced, and non-Muslims can't be, quote-unquote, civilized by colonialism. So what we found when Muslims went to other lands is they didn't create colonies and they didn't extract their resources and rendered the natives into poverty. What we see is that every land that Muslims spread to, we see that they became equally prosperous. So much so that the lands such as Cordoba in Al-Andalus or Spanish Iberia rivaled the capital Baghdad. Of course, the capital Baghdad wasn't where Islam came from. That too was a land that Muslims came to. And that rivaled in grander significance, obviously later on, Istanbul, Constantinople, which itself was a land that Muslims came to. And so Muslims didn't colonialize or render these cities and towns subject and just extract their resources, but rather each of these towns and cities grew and equally prospered as the Muslim capital. So Islam wasn't actually imperialistic, and rather what it would do is more assimilate lands and bring it into itself as equal. But the Islamic civilization also developed science and technology throughout the 8th and 10th centuries and peaked economically in the 15th and 16th centuries. Muslims, though believing Islam is universal, didn't impose it on people, so that Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians could live under their own law system and were not forced to live under Sharia, because Sharia is only for Muslims who believe in Islam. However, the worst thing that ever happened to the Islamic civilization was success. It was the worst thing that ever happened to us. Immense wealth, stability, and peace in the interior of the Muslim world led to a slow decline in creativity, innovative technology, study, thought, and curiosity. This also happened to the Chinese civilization too. It's a sociological phenomenon. It has nothing to do with religion. The ink in a book may not change, but the motivation to read and understand it does. In the end, words in a book are just words and cannot help the person who loses profundity in understanding the language or the world that the book speaks about. So, divine texts can't force a believer to think about the world profoundly or to understand the world deeply. It is up to the believer to do this. And you can't understand a text until you do this, and hence that's the limitation of texts. But over this time, the Muslim world turned in on itself and was content to spend its wealth buying cheap imports from the West during the 17th and 18th centuries. After all, why manufacture something if you can buy it cheaply made somewhere else? Sound familiar today with the US and China relationship? As the thinking of the Muslim world declined, so did its ability to compete with Western military technology and military tactics. Eventually, the West realized that after many failed crusades, it could start winning military victories against the Muslim world and acquire the Muslim world's resources and wealth to benefit its burgeoning industries. The stagnation in Muslim thought led to a decline of rationality and led to the rise of superstition, alien cultural practices coming back from the frontier zones into the Muslim interior, charismatic spiritual cults, and a superficial understanding of Islam and lack of curiosity into the natural world upon which science requires. The West, led by the UK and France, began invasions of the Muslim world, starting with India and eventually Algiers, Tunis, Egypt, Afghanistan, etc. It deposed or replaced the Muslim rulers and took control over the education systems in the Muslim world, eliminating funding for religious education and teaching Western-based subjects, including Western literature and philosophy, dislocating the native Muslim populations from their own heritage or their own ability to access the intellectual heritage of their ancestors. Colonialists like Thomas Babington Macaulay in India discussed how Western education could create a new class of natives that would look like their fellow natives, but would think, speak, and have loyalty to the West. These, he foresaw, would eventually take over power and act as intermediaries. Eventually, the cost of colonialism became great, that it became cost-effective to create client regimes or puppet states, with these secular intermediaries given a facade of independence to the natives, but would act as proxies for Western economic interests, somewhat of a franchise. Religious and cultural education in the native culture was unfunded and left to poor institutions to teach, developing the impression in the Muslim world that religious scholars and savants are illiterate in science, maths, and technology. Islamic teaching institutions were either closed or controlled by the new secular rulers and restricted to only teaching spiritual, non-political aspects of Islam. This created in the Muslim world an illiteracy in Islamic political thought and philosophy. The Muslims unfortunately also learned Victorian-era British values like women can't do business and women should not own property, which were Victorian-era values of Britain at the time. They also taught the Muslim world the label homosexual and told Muslims that this new label is to be hated, when before in our own literature we don't have a label that discriminates people homosexual, heterosexual, bisexual. This was a Western import of 19th century thinking, Western thinking. Muslim women who previously could study as doctors under the Islamic education system were prevented under British colonial administration of Egypt. And Muslim understanding of religion came to resemble the British Victorian understanding of Christian social teachings. The secular rulers, mostly dictators, justified their rule by believing that Islam is compatible with their new secular autocratic government. And they came to view traditional Islam, like the West, as a backward force that was against science, technology, and economic progress. The Muslim world today is a creation of colonialism, and its regimes are cynical creations of the West and are still propped up by the West. You just have to look at the current military adventures of Britain for the last 100 years. You'll see that it's invaded Iraq or gone into Iraq 6 times over the last 100 years. Why is that? Is it just a good holiday destination for the British Army? Of course, the course of westernization hasn't stopped there. While the political systems and power have been removed from Islam, Islam itself as an idea is still intact. The next wave of westernization was to push secular liberalism upon the Muslim world to defeat this final obstacle that still resists. Secular liberal missionaries, whether atheist or Christian, or the descendants of Western educated Muslim families, are calling for the reformation of Islam itself now. And despite all the problems in the Muslim world not originating from Islam, reformists claim that opposing the reformation of Islam is denying the problem that exists in the Muslim world. And yes, there are problems in the Muslim world. No one's denying there are problems. Every group, sect, movement within the Muslim world almost weekly decries the many problems in the Muslim world. Where we disagree with the secular liberal reformists are as to what is that problem and how it can be solved. I'll now go through some common arguments as to why Islam should be reformed and why it needs to be reformed to be relevant to the 21st century. And let's put them to the test. They argue Islam needs to be reformed because circumstances, times, and cultures have changed since 1400 years ago, with the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But there's a problem with this, an anthropological and clear problem with this, is that systems aren't related to technology. Take, for example, democracy. Democracy is 2,500 years old. It's actually 1,000 years older than Islam. Islam is actually more modern than democracy. And yet, we have to reform Islam to fit the Western conception of democracy, because that's quote-unquote the modern thing to do. Technology doesn't change. Technology doesn't change humans. Humans are the same as we were 3,000 years ago. They found an old joke book in Pharaoh's Egypt, and you could still see from now, anyone who knows Egyptian culture knows that nothing's really changed much in Egyptian culture. Humans are the same. We have the same needs, the same wants, the same desires, same fears, same concerns. But rather, technology changes and helps make things easier. One could argue that technology has allowed things to be achieved today which couldn't be achieved back then. So any political system from any time period is now made more easier to be implemented because of modern technology. So when you had the time of the Islamic Caliphates, the Umayyad dynasty, the Abbasid dynasty, Ottoman dynasty, during some of those dynasties, the Islamic world, it took 1 year to travel from one end to the other. Now it's just a 18-hour plane trip. Does Islam become easier or harder to implement? It becomes easier if you are having planes and trains and automobiles and not sailing ships and camels and horses. So technology doesn't really make any real difference to humans per se. It makes life easier. So it wouldn't change your system. And the very fact that the West has a love affair with classical philosophy, and they still will teach the books of Plato, an old philosopher, right in these very universities to this very day. If they believe that Plato is still relevant for today, then why not the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam for Muslims? What about the other argument? They say Islam needs to be reformed because political problems exist in the Muslim world due to an unreformed Islam. The problem with that is Islam isn't being implemented in the Muslim world. People might say, well, what proof or evidence do you have for this? Isn't this a bold claim? Well, I'll just give you one very simple litmus test, very simple one. Saudi Arabia, Iran, Pakistan, and all the other countries have interest banking systems, which is expressly forbidden in the Quran, so much so that the language in the Quran used to describe that prohibition is that take notice of war from Allah and His Messenger, those who deal with riba, with interest. Because Islam views interest banking as a greatest injustice and source of the concentration of wealth amongst economies. And I suppose if you look at just the concentration of wealth and the wealth inequality in America and UK, you'll see that the Quran has a point. But the Quran says that God declares war on those who deal on interest, a theological war against those who deal with interest, meaning it's a very big sin, and yet all these countries have interest banking systems. Just off the bat, I don't even need to delve in anything else. That's actually quite a big one. But just so you can see that these countries are not on strict application of Sharia at all. Take, for example, the Saudis. People say, it's very common to hear them being attacked in the media, the Saudi regime. And then people say, the Saudi regime, look how they are a cause of a kind of recidivist Islam in the Middle East, and how they are anti-Western in their culture and their ideas and so on and so forth. And this is the problem we need to reform in the Muslim world. Well, I say, you know what, the Muslim world, in essence, didn't help the Saudis get to power in the first place. What you'll see is that after World War I, the British actually helped literally fund, support, and arm the Saudis to be their bully boys in the region. The Sharif Faisal, who was one of the people who led the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Turks, the Ottoman Caliphate, he refused to sign the Balfour Declaration, to accept the Balfour Declaration that gave the Palestine over to Zionists to colonialize. So he refused to accept that declaration. And the British basically said, if you don't accept it, we'll unleash the Saudis on you, and we'll unleash them to depose you from power. And that's precisely what happened. In fact, you get this amazing quote, which was found from diplomatic communications. So Lady Gertrude Bell, the Oriental Secretary to Sir Percy Cox, High Commissioner of Iraq, wrote about Sir Percy's relationship with the Saudis and how they were so obedient to British interests in the region. She says she was amazed at, quote, Sir Percy's power to guide Ibn Saud. It's really amazing that anyone should exercise influence such as his. I don't think that any European in history has had made a deeper impression on the Oriental mind. Now, considering that the British colonialized India, to say that Ibn Saud's mind had had the deepest impression by the West than any other European has been able to achieve is a really significant quote. The Saudis were very much looking to the West for imitation, to obey their interest in the region, and they were put into power precisely to fulfill British interests in the region. People talk about the idea of an Islamic Caliphate, which is now filled with a lot of negative connotations thanks to the media. But historically, the Caliphate ruled over lands which you had the beautiful Cordoba or the Beit al-Hikmah of Baghdad, which was places of learning and science and tolerance, and Christians and Jews and Muslims living side by side. These were under caliphates, not under any other system. They weren't under republics or democracies or dictatorships or totalitarian regimes. It was under caliphates. The Saudis have had a history of actually fighting the Islamic Caliphate, the Ottoman Caliphate in the region. Quite how Saudis would want to support a caliphate when they themselves participated in fighting against the last Islamic Caliphate, I do not know. The other governments in the Muslim world are not different. I just picked Saudi as one example because they're the most prominent in the media. Look at Pakistan, for example. People say, oh, look at all the problems and woes of Pakistan are due to a unreformed Islam. Well, look at the political parties of Pakistan. They are mostly all, if not entirely, all secular parties. And they all come from the liberal ruling elites. The upper classes in Pakistan are secular liberals. They get their kids educated in the West. They have holiday homes in the West. And they form part of the ruling elite in Pakistan. But if you look at the Pakistani political system, has secular politics improved Pakistan? What you'll find between these different groups is they actually act quite like mafia organizations. They kill rival candidates. They have shootings in areas. If a candidate a rival MP wants to be elected in an area and does campaigning in a place that one other political party has declared its turf, there's been shootings of that rival candidate. And these are all secular parties. So I don't see how secular politics has improved countries like Pakistan or any, and I'm just picking Pakistan as one example. I can cite any other Muslim country. I'm just picking one because of limited time. See, the simple fact is that the problems in the Muslim world have not arisen from Islam because there has been no implementation of Islam. Even a recent group, which I really don't want to mention because I find mentioning their name distasteful. This recent group in Iraq was discovered by, I think it was Der Spiegel, the German newspaper, to be actually created and controlled by a group of former Saddam Baathists. Baathists are secularists, and they were from a secular group. So these Baathists are cynically supporting a facade of a religious movement. Why? Because what you don't understand in the Middle East and the Muslim world is, if anyone wants to do anything in the Muslim world, you have to claim you're legitimate in some way, shape, or form to the culture of that region. And the culture of that region is Islamic, so to speak, or at least it claims to be Islamic. So everyone in the region claims that they're Islamic. Saddam Hussein claimed that he was not incompatible with Islam. Saddam Hussein was a brutal secular dictator. He massacred many Muslims who were politically active, of which the West would probably derogatorily call Islamists. Saddam Hussein killed Islamists by the thousands, but he himself put Allahu Akbar on the Iraqi flag. He claimed he was a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He would name massacres of Kurds after Quranic verses, and his children, the Iraqi Baathists, are doing no different at all. Now, of course, you might say, well, you seem to be critical of perhaps Western democracy or secular systems. Is the alternative a dictatorship or a theocracy? And I don't know if anyone here studies political science. There are quite a lot more different types of political system than just dictatorship, theocracy, fascism, or democracy. There's actually quite a lot more other different types out there. But many people who talk about opening up people's minds and saying, let's consider other possibilities out there which might involve public engagement in different and new and innovative or interesting ways, people say, no, this must be only the limited types of either fascism, dictatorship, or whatever. Say, no, there are more than those types of government. And we can go into that a bit later. The other reason people are claiming to demand a reformation of Islam is they say that it's because Muslim societies suffer from social problems. And these social problems are due to an unreformed Islam. Well, this is, again, incorrect. Yes, the Muslim world has certain, or actually quite a lot of problems, putting it mildly. It suffers from problems which Islam considers unacceptable, such as laziness, let's say lying, unserious promises, gossip, lack of creativity, superstitious practices like making amulets, or customary pre-Islamic practices like performing clitorectomies, which occur in only some areas in the Muslim world, which has been called female genital mutilation. These are not Islamic practices. These are not things that Islam esteems to be virtues. So then how is this reforming Islam going to change these things which do not originate from Islam in the first place? If Islam doesn't have anything to do with these things, then how would changing Islam? It's like saying, to reform the Muslim world, we need to reform Buddhism. What connection does Buddhism have to these problems in the Muslim world? None. What connection does Islam have to these problems in the Muslim world? None. So it's misdirected to say we need to change Islam when you're talking about a society that's not living by Islam. There are other problems which have crept in due to the centuries of mental degradation, unfortunately, that has hit the Islamic civilization. Fatalism and defeatism are also problems, where people say that the end times are here, and so we should all be passive and do nothing and let the end times come. Because somehow, even though the Prophet Muhammad didn't know when the end times were going to come, we now somehow know the end times are here, apparently. Or they will say, let's wait for this promised Redeemer, the Mahdi, to come. It's just around the corner now. Again, the Prophet Muhammad didn't say when the Mahdi would be arriving, and yet now there are Muslims who claim that he's just around the corner and we should now be passive, do nothing to change our situation because he'll deal with everything. Like the purpose of human existence was to be created just to wait for the Mahdi to do all our job for us. I don't think so. But these problems are not from misunderstanding of Islam, but a ability to think and understand profoundly. Islam, under no interpretation, allows lying for profit or gain. It doesn't allow corruption or laziness or gossip or making amulets, charms, and other superstitious practices. Islam doesn't allow the performing of clitorectomies. So then it doesn't need reform. It needs to be applied. It needs to be implemented. If the medicine isn't bad and you're not applying it, then why change it? Why not just apply it? Let's take one particular example that you might have seen in the media, which secularists usually jump on. They say, look at the tragic killing of Farhunda Malikzada in Afghanistan. It was a woman who basically complained about some amulet seller that was selling amulets, what she called superstitious nonsense. And because some of these amulets have bits of Quran in them, the seller accused her of blaspheming the Quran, and she was brutally beaten to death. She had her hijab torn off, and she was beaten to death by a baying mob. Now, first of all, I'm shocked by the cynical campaign that her death has been used to promote. She wasn't a secularist. In fact, people believe her to be a Salafist or a Salafi, a movement which is maligned by secularists, and yet this movement is against superstition and against amulets and against a lot of these practices. So she was a Salafi, and she was challenging folk superstition, and the secularists claim it is proof of a need for secular reformation, when I think we'd all agree that all that shows is that this baying mob of individuals need to have their minds and hearts reformed, if not stricter punishment for what they did. But at the very least, the society needs to be reformed. But it's not Islam that's the problem, because the so-called fundamentalist Islam wasn't practiced there by the baying mob. The fundamentalist Islam was actually being practiced by Sister Farhunda when she decried the amulet seller. That was the fundamentalist Islam aspect of that story. But she was beaten to death by a mob who didn't use critical thinking, who didn't say, wait a second, let's let the authorities look into this, or let's see what's happening. They acted rather savagely and without thought, and that is the problem in the Muslim world. They act first and think later, or if they think at all. Let's take another example. In Pakistan, the Imam of a mosque, Muhammad Shafi, and his son, Muhammad Aslam, which were from a Deobandi sect, which are Salafists influenced, or some people call them, secularists would call them a traditionalist or fundamentalist form of or interpretation of Islam. They were given life imprisonment under Pakistan's blasphemy law for tearing down a poster on a wall which called to celebrate the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The case against them was called by local Brelvi leaders a type of spiritual movement or sect. So you had again the fundamentalists, quote unquote, here were the victims of an irrational behavior, prosecuting them because they disagreed with a poster, because they don't take the idea that Muslims should celebrate the Prophet Muhammad's birthday because they believe it's an imitation of Christians. That's their opinion. And the other opinion is that you can celebrate it. And because of this little disagreement, they were sentenced to life in jail for that. Is that something that traditional Islam would have punished? Well, if you look at all the traditional Islamic cases from 1,400 years, if they were on that system, they would have never been punished for it. Theological disagreements are allowed in Islam. And they were clearly not blaspheming against the Prophet Muhammad at all whatsoever. They were just expressing that they don't believe in celebrating the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad. So the reason why I cite these two examples is because the usual narrative is that this movement or group in the Muslim world called Salafis or Salafists, they are one of the major causes of problems in the Muslim world, and they are the ones who are intolerant and are persecuting many people. But in those two examples, they were the victims of intolerance in the Muslim world. So it's clearly not Salafism that's causing intolerance. I'm not saying this to exonerate Salafism or take any position on that movement, but just to show there's a deeper problem, and it's not related to any particular sect or school of thought in Islam. The Muslim world is in a state which I think many thinkers would describe, many Muslim thinkers would describe as a state of anarchy. And the word used in Arabic was a type of like a jahiliyyah. Many people have said this is called a jahiliyyah, a time of ignorance. Because in a state of anarchy, anarchy is not the absence of a political power or group. There's always going to be power. Even if the British government disappeared tomorrow and everyone was living out for themselves, gangs would normally form, or groups would form, or tribes would form, and people would start defending their areas, and there would always be a hierarchy. Humans can't escape hierarchy. However, what anarchy really means is not absence of government. What anarchy really means is absence of any higher principle other than survival. And in the Muslim world, ever since colonialism, ever since the devastation of our own education system and the cutting off of our access to the classical Islamic thought, the Muslim world hasn't known what it's living for, what purpose it's here for, or what it's meant to be doing. It just survives. And in such a situation of a system or society where there is no other higher ideal except survival, the only currency that remains in that society is honor and respect, which is why you'll see in the Muslim world people will fight and kill for honor and respect, much like gangland culture, I would say. Very much so. Why? Because gangs don't, if one of your business partners defrauds you, you can't go to the police because maybe you're dealing in something illicit. You'd have to deal with it yourself. And that's how the Muslim world unfortunately is. There's no confidence in the political powers. In fact, the government in the Muslim world is just the biggest gang out of the many types of gangs and sects that are there, and they are fighting. And this is a problem. Now, people say, well, can imitating the West change things? Did the West gain ascendancy during the last 300 to 400 years because they were enlightened by secular liberalism? Well, the answer is no. You see, most of the culture, laws, and rights you see the West touting today as evidence of the reason for their advancement is completely recent, mostly in the last 100 years, in some cases, the last 10 to 15 years. Here's a few unsavory facts from recent Western history, a time when they were calling themselves civilized and taking upon themselves to civilize the world. In the UK, the oldest secular liberal country in the world, women didn't have the right to vote until 1918. Women couldn't own their own property and had to give it to their husband upon marriage. And husbands were liable for all the debts of their wives, including extravagant shopping trips. This wasn't changed until 1870 in the UK. Most people couldn't vote until 1918 in the UK, when the restriction on how much property you needed to own was relaxed. Initially, when democracy was set up in the West, it was only for the rich. The homosexual activity wasn't made legal in the UK until 1967, and only if it was done in private between two people. It was only legalized between more than two people, or let's say, quote unquote, public, not in public, but within more than just two people, in 2003, equalizing it with heterosexual, sex between heterosexual couples. The blasphemy law wasn't abolished in the UK until 2008 and replaced by religious and racial hatred laws. In the US, it was practically abolished in 1952, a blasphemy law, but there are laws that still remain on many statute books, actually being reintroduced in 1977 into the state of Pennsylvania, which now has a blasphemy law, and also like Maryland. The UK only abolished slavery in 1833. In the US, it was only abolished amongst non-criminals in 1865. A reason why I say non-criminals is because slavery is legal today in the US, according to the 13th Amendment, but only for criminals. So criminals can be legitimately put into slavery. It also begs us to wonder why the American penal system seems to be incarcerating a disproportionate number of African American prisoners, and they are put to work in chains on the railroad, which is reminiscent of what their ancestors were made to do by the same people, the same institutions 100 years ago. Has anything really changed? Is an interesting question for another time. In the 19th century, secular liberal America and Britain, surgeons would perform clitorectomies as a treatment for insanity amongst women and also to curb masturbation. And that was done 19th century, under the time when Britain and America were the foremost secular liberal countries in the world, touting that they were civilized. What about the discussion that, well, maybe the adoption of secular liberalism will lead to happiness and will lead to improved rates of crime, so removed or rather decreased rates of crime in the Muslim world? Well, if you look at globally, the most happiest countries are not actually European countries or United States, it's actually South America. Actually, the most happiest countries, and they usually are some of the most poorest countries. Some point to the Scandinavian countries as a good example of secular liberalism and how well people are behaved there. Even if that is so, one big question, why not other secular liberal countries? Why only Scandinavia? Because secular liberalism is being applied on a whole number of different countries, much more than Scandinavia. Why only Scandinavia is an interesting question. But all that would show is Scandinavia has a different and very distinct culture, distinct from the rest of Europe. It is more community-centered rather than individualistic, and has socialist systems with tax rates as high as 70% to 80% on the average worker. But the state will take care of everything, I'm told. But what also most people don't realize is, strangely enough, and this might not be connected, but Scandinavia is also the highest consumer of antidepressants in the world. I don't know if that's connected, but I'll leave it for other people to look into. But there is an interesting statistic when people say that Islamic Reformation, the Muslim world, is having so many social problems, and a very surprising one. Michael Stephen Fish, who is a political science professor at the University of California in Berkeley, said, very interestingly, after a study of crime rates, more specifically murder rates in Muslim countries compared to non-Muslim countries. Here's his research. He says, murder rates average 2.4 per annum per 100,000 people in Muslim countries, but 7.5 in non-Muslim countries. Murder rates such are found in predominantly Christian Brazil, Russia, Mexico, and South Africa, but these rates are unknown in the Muslim world. The murder rate in the world's most populous Christian country, the United States, is 6 per annum per 100,000 people. In the most populous Muslim country, Indonesia, it is 1 per 100,000 people per annum. In Turkey, it is 4. Further statistical tests confirm what is obvious from the raw data. More Muslims equals less homicide. So the murder rate in the United States is 6 times more than the murder rate in the largest Muslim country, Indonesia. So I don't think everything's all black and white. The Muslim world is completely beyond the pale of salvation. I think there are still very strong community values in the Muslim world. There are very strong Islamic values in the Muslim world. We shouldn't paint a blank brush over the matter. I could argue that in the United States, they have very big social problems. 17,000 Americans will be shot by their fellow citizens every year. There is a mass shooting in America for almost every day of the year, and yet America and its politicians wax lyrical about the threat of terrorism, despite the fact that 17,000 of their people will be killed by sources other than terrorism. Something that even Obama raised as an issue himself. What about the claim that the Reformation of Islam will create material development, progress in economics and scientific discovery in the Muslim world? When the West successfully reformed Christianity, then it progressed in science, technology, and economics. So surely Islam would need the same reformation. Well, first and foremost, what does science and progress have to do with social laws? I could argue that China isn't secular or liberal, not even democratic. Are they backward technologically? Are they backward in development or industry? Not really. I saw an amazing discussion by a Chinese political scientist called Eric X. Lee, who basically went on TEDx and to Oxford, and he just lambasted Western democracy, said it doesn't represent the needs of the people. And he actually cited how the Chinese system is more responsive to the needs of the people via the Communist Party, and that the vast majority of all political or Chinese political leaders have been from poor families. They originated from poor families. How many of those could say the same amongst Western politicians, he pointed out. He got rousing applause. I was amazed. If I said exactly the same thing that he did, I'd be accused of being an extremist. I guess you're extremist unless you're Chinese. He also predicted the downfall of Western civilization and so on, but that's a different discussion. Please read and study his presentations on TEDx and Oxford University. But the discussion about Reformation ignores history. The history is all wrong about what happened in the West. You see, the West didn't progress once they reformed Christianity. They began progressing from as early as 1100. The technological change in the West and the scientific method and the new universities which were built by, well, does anyone know the first universities in the West? Who built them? Anyone know? Sorry? No, in the West. Right. Sorry? No, the Catholic Church. They built the first universities in the West. First scientists, Catholics. All the people researching into a new model of planetary motion, of the heliocentric model, of the geocentric model, all Catholics. Galileo was patroned by the Pope to write his writings, and he wasn't burned or killed by the Catholics at all whatsoever. This is a falsehood. In fact, the Enlightenment, or the birth of secular liberalism, is actually a byproduct, a later unintended byproduct of the Western Renaissance. The Western Renaissance started in around 1100 and progressed for about 600 years with no secular liberal government at all. By the time you saw secular liberal government arise, they weren't medieval at the time. They were already wearing those three-pointed hats and Baroque outfits and all these new developments in technology. The West had been developing for 600 years without secular liberalism or even democracy for that matter. There is no connection between ideology and scientific progress. The connection is that what happened to the West is when they encountered Islamic civilization, their minds were completely blown by the possibility of material progress. And the Catholics patroned and funded Western initiatives, or Christendom initiatives at the time, to study science and to study this knowledge and to then take it forward. Nothing to do with secularism, liberalism, atheism, or humanism, or anything like this. It's a fallacy of history that people anachronistically assume, but that wasn't the case. The Western, or the Christendom's dark ages, didn't happen because of religion. It happened because of the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire didn't fall and never had a dark ages, and they were Christian. So, for people who like history, time to do some homework. You'll see that it's not what Hollywood tells you it is, not by far. The scientific revolution happened in the 1600s to 1760, they say. The Industrial Revolution, being a transition to new manufacturing processes, happened sometime between 1820s and 1840s, they say. Those revolutions all happened while the West were still experimenting with women's rights and denied most people the vote, had slavery, outlawed homosexuality, and blasphemy. So at the time of the scientific revolution, at the time of the Industrial Revolution, women couldn't own property, most people couldn't vote, there was slavery, and there was laws against blasphemy. And yet, all those laws didn't stop the scientific revolution or the Industrial Revolution. Now, these laws are unsavory laws, of course, but I'm just showing you how those laws weren't linked to Western progress or technology. That's the only point I wanted to show with citing those rather nasty laws that the West took time to discover. Obviously, Islam gave women's rights to own a property from day one. We never realized it only 100 years ago. Adam, if I can pronounce his name, Przeworski and Fernando Limongi in the Journal of Economic Perspectives noted something very interesting. They said, after much studies into democracies versus non-democracies, they said, well, we do not know whether democracy fosters or hinders economic growth. There was no correlation between democracy and economic growth. Then the two are not linked. So these are just some points. The UK isn't even fully democratic either. The figurehead is unelected, and the House of Lords, the upper house in this parliament, is completely unelected, and they even have members of the clergy as lawmakers in the House of Lords. Is Britain a theocracy? Interesting question for maybe you guys to look into. And I'll leave it with the last point to wrap up this lecture before I go to the question-answer session. People say that Islam needs a reformation to pick up the Enlightenment project of the Mu'tazilites, and they're translated as rationalists in the Islamic history, and the thinkers like Ghazali, Farabi, Ibn Rushd, and Ibn Sina, and Ibn Khaldun. These were the rationalists, and they were silenced, and then the Muslim world stopped progressing after these people were silenced. Well, they weren't silenced, which is why we still have their books today. They weren't suppressed, and the Mu'tazilites actually were the ones who were actually doing the persecution to force their theological opinions on the people. But there's a big fallacy. Those guys are not secular liberals of any kind, or even pro-democracy. First of all, the Mu'tazilites held strong opinions on theology. However, they were not a school of Islamic jurisprudence. Mu'tazilites believed in Sharia. They believed in all the hudud penal laws, and they believed in the obligation of an Islamic Caliphate as a political system. The only ones who didn't were very few, including Al-Assam and Abad bin Salman, and the Khawarij group. And they didn't believe in the obligation of caliphate because they didn't believe in any government. They were anarchists. They said that we don't need government, full stop. That was their argument. They didn't say we need democracy or we need dictatorship. No, they didn't say that. So these were the Mu'tazilites. But the majority of Mu'tazilites believed in the obligation of caliphate, and many of them were jurists applying Islamic law and Sharia. They were not a school of jurisprudence. They were only a school of theology, talking about things like free will and God's divine predestination. That was what they mostly focused on. Furthermore, the Mu'tazilites were very fervent denouncers of their fellow Muslims, or what was what we call takfir in Arabic, which means to denounce or to excommunicate someone from the fold of Islam. The Mu'tazilites would takfir everyone, almost everyone who disagreed with them. It got so bad that a contemporary commentator called Abu Hayyan al-Tawheed remarked, "I don't understand what takfir means for them. Why can't they put an end to all that ordeal?" They just kept on takfiring everyone who disagreed with them, the Mu'tazilites. So to those reformists who tried to say that they want to follow the tradition of the Mu'tazilites aren't your friend, and they'd probably takfir you too. What about the thinkers like Ghazali? Well, Ghazali was a jurisprudent, believed in Sharia, is now esteemed to be one of the great thinkers of Islamic orthodoxy today. What about Farabi, they say? Farabi, a great thinker, studied Aristotle, studied Plato. Was he a secular liberal or someone who is secular? Well, no. He studied Plato and Aristotle and came to the same conclusion that Plato and Aristotle came on democracy, which was, he called it an ignorant system. He said, and he was a genius, he said that in such a system, the rich would probably have power over everybody else, when it was purely theoretical to him. And just studying this system, he said the rich would most likely dominate that system. And he rejected it, and he called it Madinat al-Jahili, a ignorant system. You can read this if you want to know more about his discussion of democracy in Kitab al-Siyasa al-Madaniyya, the book of the political regime by al-Farabi. Please have a look at it. What about Ibn Rushd? Ibn Rushd was a Maliki jurist. Maliki is a school of thought within Sunni Islam. He applied Sharia law. He believed in all the Sharia commandments and laws and so on. He's described by the West as the famous commentator of Aristotle because he was read very fervently in the West, in Christendom, as a commentator towards Aristotle's works. He believed that the first four caliphs was the ideal state. The first caliphate of the first four caliphs of Islam were the ideal state, and he had the same opinion with regards to democracy and as Aristotle and Plato did. Likewise with Ibn Sina, Ibn Khaldun, these people are not secular liberals at all. Again, believers in Sharia, believers in Caliphate, and believers in the supremacy of divine law. To any secular liberals who want to cite these people, we should tell them, stop trying to find people in Islamic history and misrepresent them in such a way to depict them as on your side. As the well-noted opinions of Ghazali, Farabi, Ibn Rushd, Ibn Sina, Ibn Khaldun attest, they are not your friends. As Muslims, we need to reclaim our own heritage from such disingenuous distortions and intrusions. And I think, so I'll kind of round it up there and leave it there. There are still many points which I could say, but for the sake of allowing a vibrant and challenging Q&A, I will leave it there. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions. Just want to make a point that it's not just questions I'm welcoming, but also people who want to disagree with me and challenge it. I'm all welcome to that as well. We need to actually also hear challenge, not just blindly accepting what is being told. But your question, sir.
Thank you for your talk. Just back to your point about you saying that Islam being younger than democracy and therefore being modern. I find that quite strange to find the same theory by younger brothers more modern than me, or communism is more modern than Islam or democracy. So my question is, what is being modern? What does that mean to you? What does modern mean, especially in the context of Islam and the world we live in today?
Sure. Thank you for that question. Well, I was actually responding to the argument where people said that because Islam is old, is 1400 years old, and let's say secular liberalism is modern, it's more recent, that by dint of that fact alone, we should adopt the youngest system as opposed to the older system. And I pointed out the hypocrisy of that and the fact that if they were to play by their own rules, they would have to abandon democracy and accept Islam being a newer system, or whatever system is even newer than that. So that was why I mentioned it. Obviously, newest doesn't mean best, right? New things could be also very nasty as well. I think there's a lady up there who has her hand up. I've just passed the microphone to her.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, go on.
Thank you for this interesting speech, and thank you for your warm welcome, especially for non-Muslim, which I'm part of. So I learned lots of things, lots of interesting things here. I'm also from France.
You're from where, sorry?
I'm also from France.
Bienvenue à notre présentation.
Merci. And I also teach comparative law, so I'm a law professor. And in my course, I try to teach Muslim law, but I'm very far from knowing Muslim law. So I have actually two questions. First, I'd like to solve a problem I have, and I'd like to ask you to all Muslim community.
Sure.
About the caricature of the Mohammed Prophet,
Sure.
Mohammed,
Yeah.
by Charlie Hebdo
Yeah.
in France. As you pointed in your speech, freedom of speech and all human rights are actually universal. They're not especially from West, but also they are also part of Muslim culture and support. So I have a simple question: is that forbidden or not? And the second question is, don't you think that it is separation between West and Muslim world that has expired? Because I heard your speech, and you kind of always talk about the West world as opposed to the Muslim world. And in my world of 2016, there's a multipolar world. So don't you think that this separation between West world and Muslim world has indeed expired?
Okay, thank you for your questions and points. So I'll answer them with the last first. So is there a expired boundary between the West and Islam? Well, I'm not actually the main person that uses the word West. The West has been using the word West to describe themselves and other people for centuries. Well, not for centuries, since the 19th century, when a Russian came up with the idea to call them the Westerners, because they weren't accepted as true Europeans. So Russians are Europeans, but not us. So they're East, we're West. That's where it arose from as an idea. So the West has always called themselves a separate, distinct set of group. Before that, it was the Christian Europe, and before that, it was Christendom. So they've always called themselves by different names, but the most recent, you could say, secular and acceptable name now is the West. So they use that term, and it just means basically the descendants of 14th century Catholic countries from the Western Roman Empire, or the Western Roman Church rather. That's really the people who are considered to be the Western peoples, because the Catholic Church created a kind of homogenizing culture which made them distinct from the Eastern Roman Church, the Orthodox Church, separated from the Greek speakers, the Latin speakers. Hence, most European languages, Western European languages are from Latin origin because of the church going around and teaching these new German barbarians that had just conquered the Roman Empire Latin, basically. And the interesting thing is, of course, that the irony is, of course, is all the descendants of of the 14th century Catholic countries are not originally from the Roman Empire. These are all Germanic barbarians who invaded the collapsing Western Roman Empire and just took over the place, basically. And then the Catholic Church started to preach to them, and they converted to Christianity, and they adopted Latin in their language. But that became the West. They became different from the Slavic Eastern Orthodox Church believers, community, and so on and so forth and so on. So that's a brief definition of what the West is as a civilization. So they use that term, and they keep using that term. Their politicians will keep using that term. So when they stop using that term, then hopefully we'll look at whether we can stop making that boundary. But the fact that they keep using that term to describe themselves and against other people, it's not from us which is coming that term. It's their own self-description. Civilizations. I don't think there's been there's a melding of borders now, because Islam will never. It's very difficult for the West to accept Islam as being part of the West, for example. And this problem is greatly evidenced in France, of all countries. 10% of the population of France is Muslim. You'd think that Islam would be welcomed as a European religion, given the same acceptance and welcome as every other religion, or at least the Christian religion. But unfortunately not. It's viewed as an alien system. In France, and this leads me to my next point, the point which you raised about the Charlie Hebdo depictions. France doesn't believe truly in free speech. Neither does any of the West governments either. It believes in speech that protects its taboos, but not other people's taboos. And again, the philosopher Eric Exley, the Chinese political scientist, he actually made this point himself very glibly. Basically, in France, did you know that it is banned the works of Ahmed Deedat, some of his books? Ahmed Deedat is a Muslim you could say, let's say, a apologist. He does debate. He used to do debates, and he used to call to Islam. He focused only on theology. Only on theology he focused on. And yet France banned a lot of his books. It's now banned. I couldn't believe it until I checked the French statutes on the matter, where it talked about a list of banned materials, and he's banned in France. He's just writing theology books. What's wrong with Ahmed Deedat? If you want to talk about freedom of speech, ask Dieudonné Mbala, the French comedian. Ask him how free is France regarding speech and so on. Not very free, of course. So, of course, if you want to insult the French flag in public and do something bad with it in a public area, you can't really do that in France. And there's a few other laws that restrict speech, which I'm not going to go into, but I've done some debates on freedom of speech, whether it exists in France or not, and we've gone through those things. Of course, the most egregious lack of freedom in France is the freedom of expression of Muslims. For example, you can't wear a niqab in public in France. You can't pray in public in France. You can't wear a hijab, like you sisters in the audience, you can't do that in a French school. You cannot practice your faith in a French school expressing that. So I think that France has a big problem with freedom of speech, which only protects its own taboos and not other people's taboos. Now, what I would say is that in Islamic law, we don't believe in insulting people's beliefs. In the Quran, it even says that as Muslims, we shouldn't be insulting, like, for example, polytheists' belief. Now, as Muslims, we think that polytheism is a very big affront to God, because to assign partners to God, to assign that God is somehow anthropomorphic or has or shares his power with beasts and creatures and so on and so forth, we find it to be a big affront according to our theology. But we're told in the Quran not to insult that religion. Of anyone who believes in polytheism, we're not told to insult their gods, lest they insult our God in their ignorance. So if we don't like our God to be insulted, we shouldn't insult their gods. But it doesn't mean you can't debate and criticize. Sorry? Oh, you've heard representation. I know. Okay. By a picture. But, okay, the problem or the criticism against Charlie Hebdo wasn't because they just drew a picture of the Prophet Muhammad. There is a statue, a stone relief in, I think it is the Supreme Court of Justice in the United States. There's a statue of the Prophet Muhammad, his image, on the wall. Muslims haven't been angry about that. I mean, sure, we find it distasteful, but because it wasn't intent to insult. Do you understand? Now, I say there's one specific caveat here. I'm not saying that violence or what happened to Charlie Hebdo was justified. So the issue with Charlie Hebdo's just depictions was because of the insulting nature. And if you actually saw the depiction of they claimed it was the Prophet Muhammad, it was of a naked person on all fours with the picture showing his backside quite explicitly and so on and so forth. Not really artistic expression for the sake of art or sake of some intellectual endeavor. So that's the point. So if France wants their flag to be protected from disrespect, they shouldn't be disrespecting the things that we hold dear as well. And that would be my response so treat others as you would like to be treated, I believe.
I think there's a hand up here on this side, and then the gentleman over there.
Sure.
Yes. Hello, thank you very much for the very interesting talk. My question is whether you believe that secular communities or states that you've mentioned in the West, or whatever you refer to, for example, Britain, have found themselves in the same stagnation or lack of progression that you've discussed with, basically Islamic states or Muslim countries, and if not, or if so, why is the difference? Can you pinpoint them?
Okay. Well, if you look at the period of time that Muslims were at the forefront of technology and progress and so on, so we say it kind of started to taper around the 15th or 16th centuries. Islam had already been around for 800 years. So by the time that Muslim progress and technology finally stopped, it was 800 years had passed since the beginning of Islam. It's quite a long time for a civilization. It becomes very mature at that point in time. As for whether the West is stagnating, that wouldn't be an issue. That would just be, I can only give you my personal opinion on the matter because it's not going to be an Islamic opinion. It's just going to be my personal opinion on the matter. And I think that the fact that you have in the West the decrease of the manufacturing sector and increase of services sector, which is just people, serving coffee or whatever, services basically, not actual manufacturing or making things. And you have, it's all outsourced to China, outsourced to India, outsourced to South America and so on and so forth. And you're seeing that there's a brain drain in the West where you have to import doctors and scientists and engineers and so on and so forth to start making the things and treating the sick and the unhealthy from other countries, I think is very similar to what happened in the Ottoman Empire around about 1600s. I think that's very similar. As to whether the West is declining after having after achieving wealth and security and stability for a period of time due to constant wars outside its borders is a different discussion. I can only speculate, but I think it's similar to what happened to the situation of the Ottoman state around about the 1600s. What you'll find with many Western observers when they went to the Ottoman Caliphate was they described the Muslims as decadent, which is very fascinating as a concept. Muslims are decadent. You certainly wouldn't think that if you think you're going into a quote-unquote fundamentalist society that somehow they're going to be decadent. But the Muslims were described as decadent because they had very lavish lifestyles. They had wonderful clothes, they had wonderful abodes, they had loads of food, they had abundance of wealth. They were living very comfortably. And you know what? Comfort, it kills the mind, unfortunately. That's my point. Ibn Khaldun, some could say he was the grandfather of sociology. He predicted that sedentary lifestyle will eventually lead to stagnation. He predicted this. And we were living out. Some could even say that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ predicted it too, when he said that knowledge will disappear from the Muslim world with the death of scholars until no knowledge remains, and the people will take ignorant leaders, ignorant people as their leaders. Or that there's a time, at that time, Muslims would guard the meaning of the Quran and not the words, but there'll become a time where we'll guard the words and not the meaning, to paraphrase the narration. So basically, we'll pay more attention to the outward form of the words and not the meaning of the Quran. So some would say that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ prophesied this, but this is speculation, obviously, on my part. So that's all I could say about that. So as to whether the West is declining, I don't know, but there's certainly a big feeling about it. I think there's a recent newspaper article which came out, not an article, but it was a political analysis piece, which said that Western military capabilities have lost their edge against Russia. They think that basically if Russia wants to invade Eastern Europe, there's nothing the West could do to stop them now. And they say quite scarily. Right? So I don't know all that means, but there's a general feeling that the West is not as powerful as it used to be, and that China and Russia and India are not as weak as they used to be. Certainly, China is certainly not as weak as it used to be. The poor Chinese suffered a lot under Britain. The Chinese wanted to have trade relations with Britain and didn't want to import opium from British production. They didn't want opium from Britain, and Britain wanted to buy China, porcelain from China, right? So Britain didn't like that trade agreement. They didn't like the fact that they would have to spend money to buy porcelain, but China doesn't want any of their goods. So what Britain did is it invaded and attacked China twice, called the Opium Wars. And the reason why it's called the Opium Wars, to drug push on the Chinese, opium, so that the Chinese would be addicted, and then they would create a market for opium and for Britain to export it to China and then have money from that. So the Chinese are not as vulnerable as they once were now, and that would never happen now, of course. So judge for yourself whether the West is in decline or not, based on these points, though. But I could only engage in speculation.
I really like your talk, but there is I think I'm going to have to play devil's advocate.
Please do.
I'm not going to say it's just to challenge you on some points. One was that you said the biggest problems in the Islamic world were things like clitorectomy, lying, gossip, making amulets, atheism, defeatism. I'm not trying to support.
I said social problems in the Muslim world.
Okay, so those are specific social. Because I thought you said those were it doesn't take genius to think of any problems.
Oh no, I said those are the social problems. Yeah, the question before that or the claim before that I raised was the claim that Reformation needed to solve the political problems, and then that was under the heading social problems. So there's political and social problems.
They're kind of tied into each other, right? Society.
There are connections. Yes, yeah, of course, yeah.
It's the same thing. It's a bit of a lack of imagination to think. I'm not accusing you of that. Maybe you're trying to separate them out. That's fine. I think it was quite funny. You said in 1967 the UK, stopped the laws which are homophobic. But isn't it illegal in a lot of Muslim countries? And maybe whether it's founded in the Quran or not, I don't know. I just read a quote directly from the Quran. It's talking about Lot and Abraham. And whenever I look at, I actually like to look at the Quran first, rather than believe what every white guy in a suit says. But I just find that strange how that's like a criticism against the West, but it's still in Islamic countries, it's illegal to be gay, and to be condemned to your nature, I think that's pretty, it's just sad. I think you also mentioned the blasphemy law in 2008 being changed, but apostasy is one of, apostasy, I don't know, Richard Dawkins asked this question, what's the punishment for apostasy in Islam?
First and foremost, I just want to set a bit of the context of a Islamic system. The idea, I mentioned a few points about the Caliphate and Sharia, and I didn't go into detail about it because I wanted to not have an extremely long lecture that would maybe require a number of lectures. The Caliphate is a government that the Muslims elect or select by a process of consultation. And the Caliph has one job, and that is to implement justice and implement the laws of Islam, which are mostly to do with things like economics, ensuring that there's no concentration of wealth, implementing laws which prevent the poor from being exploited, and so on and so forth. And obviously to protect the Muslims and non-Muslims from external aggressors and barbarians invading the borders, and so on and so forth. So, no. It's not like democracy. It's similar in a way to Western governments, how it's run. Generally speaking, yeah, sure, you select the leader, but you don't choose the system. In the West, you don't elect the system. You have no choice in the system. You have no choice whether you can't choose communism, you can't choose, and obviously we hope we can't choose fascism, but unless you count the Conservative Party, but that's a different discussion. What you can choose is only a leader or someone you have confidence in to lead. So in that sense, yes, in Islamic system, you don't, as Muslims, you don't choose whether the system is Islamic or not, like you can't choose whether in the West it's secular liberal or not. But you can choose a leader, or by some representative, either have electoral colleges or via direct election, depending on the means of that society and the technological ability to get votes and what have you, right? So in that sense, yes. But I would argue that then the West really, in a way, actually isn't truly democratic, because according to the ancient Greeks, democracy is everyone votes on every law. Like everyone, you choose the law, you vote the policy, you even vote in court cases as well. Everybody votes, the people vote on everything. But of course, the Western Enlightenment thinkers didn't, and they said it themselves, they didn't trust the people to actually have direct power. So instead, you're going to elect people who will, as Edmund Burke said, think for you. And they will implement a system that they think you need, or whatever benefits them. And usually it's at the cost of rights vis-a-vis the rich who get these, who can campaign or fund these electoral campaigns. But that's a different discussion. So in the Islamic system, that's the Caliphate. Now, when it comes to Sharia, as I mentioned before, Muslims didn't have a word for homosexuality. We learned it from, finish the sentence, Britain, who civilized us, quote unquote. Yeah. Homosexual, I said, I'm very clear with my words. Homosexuality. All right. There was no label for someone who has feelings, because in Islam, feelings are not criminalized. All right? We're not, you can't control feelings. We all, as Muslims, theologically, we believe every Muslim, unless you're a prophet, has feelings which may contradict with theological ordinances in the Quran and the Prophet's teachings. That's the human condition. We all like that, all of us. So that's not what is criminalized. Now, there is two aspects to Sharia. There's the aspect of Sharia between you and God, which is that according to that aspect, same gender intercourse or same sex intercourse is a sin in the eyes of God, according to Islamic theology. But if it happens within the privacy of your own home, you can't be prosecuted for it in Islamic law. Actually, it's almost identical to the 1967 English law, actually, on the matter, because they allowed that activity in private. And so, although how you could legislate for people's private lives, I don't know. But the Sharia politically doesn't apply. The political application of the Sharia now doesn't apply in what people do in the privacy of their own home. The only prohibition is basically to have sex in public in full view of everybody, basically. And it doesn't apply only to same-sex intercourse, it applies to all intercourse, because the gender of the people committing the intercourse is not the problem, it's the intercourse happening in public, which breaks decency laws, Sharia decency laws. So that would be the issue, that there is no prohibition against homosexuality. Unfortunately, many Muslim scholars, certainly coming from modern institutions in the Muslim world, are following something that was inculcated into them or into their institutions 100 or so years ago by the British, which is the British Victorian values. It was homosexuality itself that was the problem. They treated it as a mental disease, and they used to subject anyone that was caught to be homosexual, having homosexual feelings, not actions, feelings. They were put under electric shock treatment in the so-called civilized West at that time. So Islam, we didn't do that, and that we think as disgusting behavior. You can't treat people like that just because they have feelings. That's a problem that the West has, and then the West now condemns us for, unfortunately, borrowing from them 100 years ago, which I think should be condemned, because unfortunately we shouldn't be learning from the West such silly labeling and discrimination and hatred and prejudice. We shouldn't be learning from the West, but that didn't come from Islam. That came from Victoria era Britain. Let me finish the second point. So Muslims don't have a problem with homosexuality because we don't even discriminate humans by labels. You're not heterosexual, you're not bisexual, you're not homosexual, you're just human beings, and Islam only judges you by the color of your character. As for the issue of apostasy, again, the English translation is Victorian era. I want to prefer to use the Arabic word because it's more expressive, irtidad. And the irtidad is literally translated as renegade, or murtad is a renegade. Literally translates as to renege or renegade. The law against that is a law against sedition and treason. And there are examples of this. So we know famous examples at the time of Prophet Muhammad. People would leave Islam and they would just walk freely out of Medina. No one would chase them. Medina was the Islamic city-state of the Prophet Muhammad. They'd be free to leave. There's no iron curtain. No one's going to keep them there. The Prophet Muhammad even completed a treaty with the Quraysh, which allowed anyone who defects from Islam returning to the Quraysh. They wouldn't be hunted down and pulled back by the Muslims and taken back to Islam. If they wanted to defect to the Quraysh, they could go off to this rival tribe of the Medinan city-state. So what we see is that what is criminalized is only sedition and treason. And if you look at English law formulations of sedition and treason, in many cases, it's quite similar. For example, that you can be prosecuted for things you utter, just uttering, imagining that the royal family is killed, or imagining that or just saying that the queen maybe shouldn't be the queen, is actually still illegal in this country. They just don't tend to apply it. But for the sake of the criminal prosecution service, I'm not saying that. I'm just iterating that as an example of what is prohibited in Britain to speak. And it's still on the law book. It's still in the English statutes. So the laws against irtidad, in effect, or the intent of them, is to prevent sedition and treason. People say these laws are against freedom of conscience, or people's choice to choose to accept or reject Islam, or it's compelling people to be Muslim. That's not the purpose of irtidad laws. The purpose of irtidad laws is to protect Islamic society from people who would basically undermine it. Example, if Germany had an irtidad law, if the Weimar Republic, Germany, had irtidad laws, as soon as some guy called Hitler popped up and said, I want to do things differently, and I don't believe that X, Y, and Z members of the German society deserve to have rights, and we should change that. If he was dealt with back then, maybe there would have been 6 million more Jews in the world today, if he was nipped in the bud, and not left to spread his hatred and basically take over the German system. So that's what the irtidad law is there for. It's to protect a society, not to prosecute people for freedom of conscience. My other point is that, and these are all from the Islamic evidences here, the Prophet Muhammad, he knew the people who were what we'd call munafiqeen, people who basically had divested themselves of Islam. They didn't follow Islam, they didn't believe in Islam, but they didn't basically go out there and try to cause sedition and, go public and basically cause a ruckus or what have you. And so the Prophet Muhammad was asked, why don't you, why are you allowing these people to basically, live and so on? And he said, well, his response was, according to one narration, was that, he doesn't want people to say that, look, he's just killing his companions. The thing is this, the Prophet Muhammad didn't come to be someone who compels people, who does witch trials or inquisition courts to see who's believing what. That's not the point. You're only judged by your actions of what you do, and that was what the point of irtidad laws were. It wasn't to compel people to become Muslim or to remain Muslim. It was rather to protect a society from people who might disrupt it. And I'll just give you one other example. Imagine a hypothetical example. So imagine an Islamic system or state or caliphate, one Muslim rises up and says, I don't believe in the Islamic right of non-Muslims to practice their faith and to exist. They should be forced to become Muslim, or we should do away with them. Which now what that person would say is against Islam, would be against Islam. If we didn't nip that person in the bud, it might lead to the killings of loads of non-Muslims, for example. So in order to protect, the lives of people, we'd have to apply the sedition and treason law on that individual to protect the society from potential massacres, killings, and sectarian violence. And that's what irtidad laws are for. They're for protection of society, not to compel people to be Muslim.
Thank you for the lecture. I've got quite a complicated question, so I don't think it'll be relieved by one answer, but just wanted some sort of insight. Islam basically prides itself in being a sort of a spiritual, a divine force that transforms the smallest details of a person's life. So, like good moral character, caring for the orphans. I'm just playing devil's advocate here as well. Then what was the need for the full rightly guided caliphs if the religion is such a divine, spiritual, transformative on its own force? Then what was the need for the full rightly guided caliphs to go on military expeditions, go to other lands, the Persian lands, and declare that this is the religion, or like that action, basically that military action? What was the need for that if the religion is such a grand spiritual force?
Okay, that's a good question. Basically, the position of secularism is that life's affairs, otherwise called as politics, it's just life's affairs, should have no connection to religion. But if you think about that philosophically, what you're saying is that your life's affairs are not connected to your purpose of life. Does that make rational sense or philosophical sense? If you believe that you have a purpose of life, it would manifest in every aspect of your life, surely, because it's related to your life. We're not here just to be disembodied creatures that don't live in the material world. We live in the material world, so to speak. Islam doesn't have a separation of materialism and spirituality. We seek the spiritual through the material world. You see, we seek, if I give a piece of bread to an orphan, for example, as a material object I'm giving to the orphan. But I'm doing it for a spiritual reason. Not doing it just to get, because the orphan's rich and will give me money. Right? So Islam doesn't have this artificial separation which occurred in the West. I might also add that Christianity, or should I say Catholic Christianity, was never actually reformed. It launched a counter-reformation and didn't change itself, basically. What you think is the reformation of Christianity is just the creation of a new sect, which is the Protestants. Christianity was never actually reformed, by the way. Just a point I might mention that there. People say it was reformed now. It hasn't been reformed. It's just the Catholic Church has just lost power, so it can't really say anything anymore. But one could argue that the problem with the Catholic Church was that the Christians, or St. Paul rather, should we say, he wanted to preach Christianity to the Romans, and the Romans wouldn't trust any political ideology or force, which obviously Jewish law was. The Mosaic law was a legal system. So he took off the legal system and just preached the spiritual ideas, and that got embraced. And the problem with that is, then the Christians, when they eventually got to power, they didn't know what to do. And then they just made up ideas, laws, institutions, and that's what led to problems in the West. It's a very uniquely, peculiarly Western problem. So as Muslims, we don't have the problem. But the Sharia is meant to be a mercy to mankind. And the reason being is, instead of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just saying, be good, and now throw you out into the wolves, basically, and you'll basically sink or swim, most of us will sink. In a corrupt world where people are forced to do bad things to survive, and they say, I had to do it, or it's necessary, or look at all this trouble. So the Sharia came to create a space whereby you are encouraged to do good, not by being forced to do it, but by eliminating all the factors and social compulsions and unfair political systems that cause people to do bad things, to eliminate corruption, at least in the public life. What you do in your private life is only between you and God. And of course, if you're going to be bad in that, then there's nothing Islam can do to make you good. But it will give you help in the public life. It will eliminate the things like, you could say, the sexualization or objectification of women in public. You see, for example, on billboards and TV and so on and so forth, sexual objectification of women. Feminists argue this, not just Muslims, that women are portrayed in such a bad way. But what you don't see, what men don't see, is this puts a great pressure on women to conform. And what women do see is it makes men devalue women or look at them in only one particular way. It creates that social, and the thing about society is that society has an existence of its own, separate from individuals, and it's a very powerful force. Social pressure, peer pressure, mob mentality, it's very powerful. So Islam and the Sharia came to protect mankind from these things. In fact, the Quran describes the Sharia as releasing humans from the shackles of this base causality which causes that push us to do bad things, to think in a bad way, to be bad influences on us. And if anyone from a secular liberal philosophy perspective would contest that, say people should be free to choose and do whatever they want, then I say fine, but you'll also then have to legalize racial hatred, speaking racial hatred, legalize selling drugs. We're talking about cocaine and crack cocaine. Why? Because the drug seller or the racial hatred spewer isn't forcing anyone to do anything bad. They're just offering it. It's up to you. Isn't it your choice as an individual, right? But even the secular liberals realize it's a silly doctrine to have, which is why they've had to re-edit their own system and to bring in prohibitions on so many different types of speech, so many different types of activities. Very regulatory now. Not like the original version that came up 100 years ago, 150 years ago. Libertarianism was a more pure system of liberalism, but it failed. Long story. So, in answer to your point, Islam came with a purpose, which was it came to offer mankind and tell mankind about the guidance from God, about God's existence, about the commands of God to release man from these very base causalities, these problems that corruption, injustice, and so on and so forth. But it couldn't do it by force because the whole point of Islam is people have to choose it to do it. But what it does have a duty to is to make the invitation. And in the Persian Empire and in the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantines as historians now call them, they were the remains of the Eastern Roman Empire that didn't fall. You couldn't preach Islam. If you preach against Christianity, you'd be killed in the Eastern Roman Empire. So you could, and of course, the Eastern Roman Empire lands were occupied. The Romans were occupying Christian Arab lands, actually, in the Levant, Egypt. These were not native Roman lands, right? They were occupied. So the Muslims came. They reduced the tax rate on the Christians to 1/10 of what it was under the burdening Romans, and the Christians were not molested. In fact, Muslims even built new cities, nearby Christian cities, not to molest the Christians. So Fustat was the original Egyptian capital. Muslims built Cairo right next to it, not to trouble the Christian Egyptians and so on and so forth. But it was actually just a military barracks to protect the borders. But then people flocked to it. It became a city in its own right. So, and there are different Islamic political theorists from the classical scholars as to why you might do just war. Going out for just war. Some say that if a neighboring non-Muslim country, the leader is a tyrant, you can basically intervene and protect the people from the tyrant. Some say that you can intervene to give the people the choice if they want to be Muslim or not, and to allow the message to be spread. Some people say if they allow you to just to go and talk about Islam and without persecuting you, then no need for intervention, and so on. Some people say that intervention, and because there are different Islamic scholars on the matter, there's not only one issue, there's different Islamic scholars, by the way, classical ones, talking about this issue. One Islamic scholar would argue that the prospect of just war in Islam is to demilitarize the world. So you go around and you demilitarize, you remove their militaries of the different countries and empires, so they will stop fighting each other and they would be under the peace of Islam. Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, Hindus, no one's going to molest them, no one's going to force Sharia on them, no one's going to oppress them. They can do as they see fit, have their own courts, live their own lives, but the military security will be in the hands of the Muslims to prevent warfare, fighting, and sectarianism, and all that stuff that happened beforehand. So these are different classical opinions by Islamic scholars. And because I'm not a scholar, I can't tell you to accept any one explanation of those, but I would tell Muslims to go and research the classical scholars yourself and just hear their interesting discourses about these different theories and ideas. But unlike secular liberalism, which believes that because everyone has a right to be under secular liberalism, no one can say no to it, per se. The only debate about it amongst philosophers like John Stuart Mill and others is whether if you invade a country and you impose it on the people, whether they will accept it or not. Like, is it going to be successful? Do you think you'd be successful doing that or not? And that's the way the debate is. That's what they debate. Not is it right to do it, it's will it be successful or not intervening in other countries? That's their debate. In Islam, it's not about success or not, it's about whether it's right or not. And we don't believe that non-Muslims should be under the Sharia because they don't believe in the Sharia. It'd be absurd to, how can, Sharia is meant to get you closer to God. It's meant to be guidance of things you can do, good things that you can do to get you closer to God. But if a non-Muslim doesn't believe in Islam and doesn't believe in Sharia, then how does following the Sharia going to help a non-Muslim? So Muslims, we don't impose our ideology on the world. But the West has and is still doing. And when they say, oh, look, Muslims want to spread Islam, or they want to take over the world, they want to impose their ideology on us, they're really just projecting themselves onto us, basically. If I was them, that's what I would do. And that's what they are doing. But Islam doesn't believe in imposing Sharia on non-Muslims, and never has historically. So I don't know where they're getting that from, under three dynasties of caliphate. So that would be my answer. And I would invite you to look at the wonderful discourse of classical scholarship, all different ideas and plurality of it for yourself, and see their different ideas about just war in Islam and why it's done.
Do you have any people, any scholars like that have written on that?
There are many scholars, but because I can't play favorites, I could suggest a few names after the talk in a private capacity, but I don't want to play favorites with one particular classical scholars, otherwise I have other people saying, why not this scholar or that scholar, why not my scholar? So, like, okay, I'm not playing favorites, I just invite you to look at it yourself and research it for yourself.
It's not going to be that quick, so I'm sorry. But first of all, I think we need to make a distinction. I'm not sure if this is intentional or not, but we need to make a distinction between Arab world, Middle East, and Muslim world. They're not all the same. They are three very distinct and different categories, and I don't believe that we can convulge them into one. That's my first, it's just a comment. And my second point is a question. From what I understood is through the speech was that you believe that being a Muslim and being a liberal secularist are inversely proportional, and I can't be one and the other. It's either this or that. Something that I admire about Islam is that there is no, unlike the other monotheistic religions, is that there is no hierarchy within the system. So I can interpret the Quran just like the sheikh in the masjid, mosque. In the mosque can interpret the Quran, and these interpretations can then follow into our lifestyles, and we practice our lifestyles and religion through personal interpretation. That is an individuality, and I come from a country where Sharia is implemented, that they have inheritance laws that discriminate against me as a woman.
You're saying Iran?
Sorry?
Iran?
No.
Azerbaijan? No, okay. From Jordan, okay.
Yeah. And we go into war because of Sharia reasons that are not legitimate. We also have homosexuality is illegal in other parts of the country. And I'm sorry that I don't know the word in English. Qawmut, it was from the Dead Sea. They were homosexual and they were punished, turned upside down, and it's in a hadith that we're not even allowed to pass by the Dead Sea because it's a blasphemous region. So what I'm trying to say is that interpretations are individualistic, and the way I carry out my life is a lifestyle choice that's also individualistic. And so this relationship that I do have with God, or a lack of relationship, whatever, should be more of an individual and liberal choice instead of being an umbrella system that is created into a politicized movement and some form of religious constructive institutionalization. And secular by definition means removing politics from religion, separating them and creating them as distinct so that I am able within the comfort of my private lifestyle to practice religion, whatever that religion may be, without persecution. So I was just wondering if that.
Okay, a number of points. I think this will not allow us to take any more questions because it's quite a lot of points. So I'm going to try to go through them all. No, it's okay. No, I mean, as I said, look, I like the fact that you have engaged and challenged this discussion, and I wouldn't have it any other way. I think that you learn more from debate and discussion, which is why, I set up the Muslim Debate Initiative, which is my organization, to debate, which is why I like to see that engagement. So thank you for your point and your contentions. So we'll go through them. So the idea of politics and religion being kept separate, the problem with that is if you're a government and you have to make laws based on which criteria, which morality? Because morality, you need a moral system or criterion. And where does that moral system come from? You can't escape basing politics on religion, you only get to choose what religion it is. Now, yes, secularism, you say that's not religion per se. Well, I could say, in effect, it acts like one because it has a worldview about the individual. It has an understanding about the individual. It has an understanding about right and wrong, how you judge right and wrong. And instead of basically a religious-based government, which the Christians never perfected because their religion started off as a reformation of Judaism, cutting off the laws of Judaism unfairly by St. Paul, but that's my personal opinion, no offense to Christians. It caused this problem in the first place, which is why the West eventually had to adopt a more materialistic-based set of morality to try to find a non-denominational basis. But they ended up just forming another sectarian basis, which is secular liberalism as an ideal. And not every philosophy in this world believes in individualism. In fact, all philosophies except Western philosophies don't accept individualism. Even Buddhist philosophies, Confucianism, none. It was very much a Western innovation, brand new one, in fact. So I would say that you can't separate politics from religion. You only get to choose what religion you connect to politics. And whether you want to call that religion secular liberalism or you want to call it Islam, Christianity, Judaism, or communism, that's up to you, but there is no escape. As for individualism, that's a very good philosophical point discussion. Theologically, Islam isn't individualistic, but it's not also just society-centered, like some communist theories are. Right? Communist theories, some of them are just there's only community or society, and other extreme is individualism. And Islam is basically in between that. The humans are individuals and their society, and they both interact in different ways. And secular liberal philosophers are realizing this, which is why they are putting so many more regulations onto society to control what society says or does, including what they have now defined as extremist beliefs. Extremists according to who? What, David Cameron, Theresa May? Who are they to determine what is extreme or not in a secular society? But in the Muslim world, Muslims have been told for the last 100 years what's extremism or not by secular dictatorships teaching us that, oh no, Islam and politics, oh that's extremism to believe that. Oh, but the Prophet Muhammad did it. Oh yeah, but that's extremism, whatever. So we get that discussion all the time. Humans aren't individuals in one sense. Who taught you language? You didn't learn it yourself. Most of your tastes, your characteristics, your customs came from your genes, your family, society, what you were taught, not from yourself. You don't generate knowledge from yourself. You don't even generate language from yourself. Linguists don't even know how language even came across. I would say Adam alayhi salam was taught the name of things, but that's my theological point, Adam alayhi salam. But the linguists don't know how to explain it. So, and humans just affect each other. Humans actually act more like herd creatures than anything else, which is quite fascinating because politicians manage society on the assumption that, and predicting fairly well what would be the social effects of any law, policy, or statement they make, and they tailor it to get a guaranteed reaction, because humans are predictable for the most part. Humans are you imitate each other, and you basically will follow what is deemed by that society to be whatever is in vogue in that point in time, unfortunately. So science, sociology, anthropology contradicts the creed of secular liberalism, which is individualism in that sense. We can go more into that, but even on the Day of Judgment, according to the Quranic discourses, people be raised with their nations, or be raised with your companions, your friends, who used to advise you, and people be like, oh, why was I take you as a companion? You were such a bad influence on me, and so on. So these are, in fact, even Iblis or Shaitan or Lucifer in the New Testament, his argument is an individualistic one. People will say, oh, you taught us this and you made us do this. And he was like, I didn't force you. I just told it to you. You made the choice. Right, his argument, but it won't save him. And even in Islam, if you tell someone to do a bad deed and they do it of their own free will, you still get part of their bad deed as well. You're culpable for that. And even in Western law systems, they have to admit that too. If you tell someone to murder, you can't go to the court, hey, I didn't make that person murder. I just told that person to murder. They had their own free will. They're an adult. and say, no, you encourage that person, and we know how encouragement works in practice, so no, you also will go down for that crime. And so all I'm saying is common sense says it, even Western legal theorists are saying it, Islam says it, so the creed of secular liberalism has major philosophical problems and really doesn't fit human reality very well. That would be my contention on that. As for the issue of Jordan, I mean, Jordan, like Saudi, like Pakistan, like Iran, all the same problems there. But I want to highlight something for you to raise just the issue. People, let's say you might have heard a story that someone had a daughter or a son, and the son, let's say, became Christian, and they were Muslim. And you saw that the father killed his daughter or killed his son, saying, "Oh, I was affronted by this. I think it's horrible. My son or daughter would leave Islam, and so I killed them because there was a big shame." Right? People say, "Look, that's because of Islam." They'll say. The secularists will say, "That's because of Islam. That's why we need to reform it." And I say, "Oh, really?" Because in Jordan, a Christian father, his daughter became Muslim, and he killed her, saying it was a big shame. And yet no one says, "Oh, we need to reform Islam." Well, of course we.
Jordan,
yeah.
we're very tribal.
Okay. No. I agree with you.
It's politicized.
Yeah. No. I agree with you. Yeah.
All things and land is central to our cultures and traditions, and
Yep.
and we have a lot of interfaith marriages. Lots of my friends are Muslim and they marry Christians.
Sure.
Christians marry Muslims. So it's a different kind of system.
Oh no. I agree with you there. You see, these killings by a Christian father to his daughter that became Muslim and a Muslim father to a daughter that became Christian, it's got nothing to do with Islam per se and everything to do with culture and tribalism in the Muslim world, which is why it's pointless to reform Islam when Islam isn't the problem here. Even in England, a Sikh father, his daughter, it came in the news a couple of years ago, he killed his daughter because his daughter was westernized. Right? Sikh Indian father. Do we need to reform Sikhism as well? That's why when I point out these very horrific incidents, it's to show that Islam isn't the causal factor here. It's a sociological factor in these areas, in these lands, in these countries. These are the issues. And I'd also point out that although there isn't killing happening in that sense, but in the West, if you become Muslim, your parents will give you a bad time. People have been beaten by their parents. People have been kicked out of their houses for becoming Muslim from quote-unquote white English Christian or even atheist parents, right? And I raise this issue that why don't we see that talked about in the news a lot? Because I know a lot of converts who've been abused by their parents, beaten up, kicked out of their house, have nowhere to stay, and no one talks about that. But if as soon as a Muslim does it, oh, that's Islam there. But if someone else does it, oh, they're just crazy, or that's wrong, we condemn that. But that's just those two parents, no one else. You see? So we need to have a look at humanity. And all I'm really calling for is to say that these are human problems, but not a problem to do with Islam. And let's deal with the human problem and not be misdirected and follow the disingenuous misdirection of secular liberals who want to use these, who jump on these incidents and say, oh, it's Islam that's the problem, because it's very, very cynical of them. As for your first point, you said, the Arab world and you can't say that the Muslim world, you should say the Arab world or the Persian world or the Turkish world or whatever, right? Well, the thing is this, as a Muslim and just studying the teaching of the Prophet Muhammad, so the Prophet Muhammad said there's no difference between the Arab and the non-Arab. So if the Prophet Muhammad, who arguably eliminated racism, said that there's no difference between Arab and non-Arab, only difference is the piety of the individuals. The piety, your taqwa, your God-fearingness, your righteousness, that only makes you different in ranking in front of God, but not your race or where you're from. Well, then I'd have to concur with the Prophet Muhammad. I don't see Arabs, Persians, Turks, Somalis, Berbers, Indonesians, Malaysians, Pakistanis. I see just Muslims, because that's the teaching of the Prophet Muhammad. I'm not nationalistic. They say that secularism would eliminate sectarianism, but under secularism, there's a new sectarianism. It's called nationalism. And there have been so many wars due to nationalism. In the West, just in the last century, they had 2 massive world wars. Massive world wars under the so-called secular liberal system that creates harmony and eliminates sectarian differences. People no longer fight for religion. They'll fight for a flag on a pole. basically. And it's even more absurd. So all I will say is this. I don't see the Muslim world as being comprised of distinct parts of Persians, Turks. I see them all as Muslims, my brothers and sisters. And as for non-Muslims, I see them as my brothers and sisters in humanity as well, because we're all part of the same family, the tribe of Adam, alayhi salam. And we all should have concern over each other and care for each other. And I think that if we had a more Islamic worldview of the world, there'd be less wars.